Distinguished guests, excellencies, and friends, welcome to SHIN-DC's third Congressional Commemoration. We have over 1,000 participants joining us today for what promises to be a meaningful program with very distinguished speakers. We express our gratitude to our annual congressional sponsor, Representative Jamie Raskin, also to the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C., and to all of our co-sponsors who are listed on the program. We gather today to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to honor the survivors. The events that occurred 76 to 90 years ago resulted in a destruction of European Jewish life, including Sephardic, Romaniot, and Ashkenazi communities. And more broadly, they showed the extent of challenges to humanity. We are forever grateful for those who were at the forefront of fighting the evil for the benefit of humanity back then, the righteous, and all those who helped save Jews, including the refugees of the Holocaust. Today, there are other unique challenges to humanity, notably the pandemic. In this context, I would like to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Albert Bourla. As Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Pfizer, Dr. Bourla leads the company to deliver breakthroughs that change patients' lives through scientific and commercial innovation. As we all know, Pfizer has been a major force for transforming human health by developing, along with BioNTech, the world's first widely authorized COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Bourla is on the executive committee of the Partnership for New York City, a vice president of the IFPMA, a trustee of the U.S. Council for International Business, and a director on multiple boards, including Pfizer, the Pfizer Foundation, Pharma, and Catalyst. Dr. Bourla is a doctor of veterinary medicine with a PhD from the Veterinary School of Aristotle University in his hometown of Thessaloniki, Greece. And it's his roots in Thessaloniki, Sephardic Jewish community, that have led him to speak to us today to honor the blessed memory of his parents, Mois and Sara Bourla, residents of Thessaloniki, who were among the few there to survive the Holocaust. Dr. Bourla, thank you for joining us. It is very inspiring that the children of Shoah survivors are now on the front line of fighting today's plague. Your presence here is an honor to us. We look forward to hearing your remarks on this solemn occasion. The floor is yours, Dr. Bourla.
Thank you, Ephraim, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great honor for me to be asked to share my family's story in connection with this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Remembrance is a word perhaps more than any other that inspired me to share my parents' story. That's because I recognize how fortunate I am that my parents shared their stories with me and the rest of our family. Many Holocaust survivors never spoke to their children of the horrors they endured because it was too painful. But we talked about it a great deal in my family. Growing up in Thessaloniki, in Greece, we would get together with our cousins on the weekends, and my parents, my aunts, and my uncles will often share their stories. They did this because they wanted us to remember all the lives that were lost, to remember what can happen when the virus of evil is allowed to spread unchecked. But most important, to remember the value of a human life. You see, when my parents spoke of the Holocaust, they never spoke of anger or revenge. They didn't teach us to hate those who did this to our family and to our friends. Instead, they spoke of how lucky they were to be alive and how we all needed to build on that feeling, to celebrate life and move forward. Hatred would only stand in the way. So in that spirit, I'm here to share the story of Mois and Sara Bourla, my beloved parents. Our ancestors had fled Spain in the late 15th century after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, which mandated that all Spanish Jews either convert to Catholicism or be expelled from the country. They eventually settled in the Ottoman Thessaloniki, which later became part of Greece, following its liberation in 1912. Before Hitler began his march through Europe, there was a thriving Sephardic Jewish community in Thessaloniki. So much so that it was known as La Madre de Israel, or the Mother of Israel. Within a week of the occupation, however, the Nazis had arrested the Jewish leadership, evicted hundreds of Jewish families, and confiscated their apartments. And it took them less than 3 years to accomplish their goal of exterminating the community. When the Germans invaded Greece, there were approximately 50,000 Jews living in the city. By the end of the war, only 2,000 had survived. Lucky for me, both of my parents were among the 2,000. My father's family, like so many others, had been forced from their home and taken to a crowded house within one of the Jewish ghettos. It was a house they had to share with several other Jewish families. They could circulate in and out of the ghetto as long as they were wearing the yellow star. But one day, in March of 1943, the ghetto was surrounded by occupational forces and the exit was blocked. My father, Mois, and his brother, Into, were outside when this happened. When they approached back, they met their father, who was also outside. He told them what was happening and asked them to leave and hide, because he had to go in, because his wife and his 2 other children were home. So later that day, my grandfather, Abraham Bourla, his wife Rachel, his daughter Graciela, and his younger son David were taken to a camp outside the train station, and from then they left for Auschwitz-Birkenau. Mois, my father, and his brother Into never saw them again. The same night, my father and uncle escaped to Athens when they were able to obtain fake IDs with Christian names. They got the IDs from the head of police at that time, who was helping Jews escape the persecution of the Nazis. They lived in Athens until the end of the war, all the while having to pretend that they were not Jews, that were not Mois and Into, but rather Manolis and Vasilis. When the German occupation ended, they went back to Thessaloniki and found that all their property and belongings had been stolen or sold. With nothing to their name, they started from scratch, becoming partners in a successful liquor business that they ran together until they both retired. My mom's story also was one of having to hide in her own land, of narrowly escaping the horrors of Auschwitz, and of family bonds that sustained her spirit and quite literally saved her life. Like my father's family, my mom's family was relocated to a house within the ghetto. My mother was the youngest girl of 7 children. Her older sister had converted to Christianity to marry a Christian man she fell in love with. That happened before the war. And she and her husband were living in another city where no one knew that she had previously been a Jew. At that time, mixed weddings were not accepted by society. And my grandfather wouldn't talk to his eldest daughter because of this and after she did that. By when it became clear that the family was going to head to Poland, when the Germans had promised a new life in a Jewish settlement, my grandfather asked his eldest daughter to come and see him. In this last meeting they ever had, he asked her to take her younger sister, my mom, Sarah, with her. He thought that there my mom would be safe because no one knew that she or her sister were of Jewish heritage. The rest of the family, they went by train straight to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Toward the end of the war, my mom's brother-in-law was transferred back to Thessaloniki. People knew my mom there, so she had to hide in the house 24 hours a day out of fear of being recognized and turned over to the Germans. but she was still a teenager, and every so often she would venture outside. And unfortunately, during one of those walks, she was spotted and arrested. She was sent to a local prison. It was not good news. It was well known that every day around noon, many of the prisoners would be loaded on a truck to be transferred to another location where the next dawn they would be executed. Knowing this, her brother-in-law, my dearest Christian uncle Kostas Dimadis, approached Max Merton, a known war criminal who was in charge of the Nazi occupation forces in the city. He paid Merton a ransom in exchange for his promise that my mom would be spared, would not be executed. But her sister, my aunt, didn't trust the Germans and their word. So she would go to the prison every day at noon to watch as they loaded the truck that would transfer the prisoners to the execution site, hoping that my mother would not be among them. And one day she saw what she had been afraid of: my mom being put on the truck. She ran home and told her husband, who immediately called Merton. He reminded him of their agreement and tried to shame him for not keeping his word. Merton said he would look into it and then abruptly hang up the phone. That night was the longest in my aunt and uncle's life, because they knew the next morning my mom would likely be executed. The next day, on the other side of our town, my mom was lined up against a wall with other prisoners, my teenage mom. And moments before she would have been executed, a soldier, a German soldier on a BMW motorcycle arrived and handed some papers to the men in charge of the firing squad. They removed from the line my mom and another woman. As they rode away, my mom could hear the machine gun fire slaughtering those that were left behind. It's a sound that stayed with her for the rest of her life. 2 or 3 days later, she was released from prison. And just a few weeks after that, the Germans left Greece. Fast forward 8 years, and my parents were introduced by their families in a typical, for the time, matchmaking. They liked each other and agreed to marry. They had 2 children, me and my sister Sally. My father had 2 dreams for me. He wanted me to become a scientist, and he was hoping that I would marry a nice Jewish girl. I'm happy to say that he lived long enough to see both dreams come true. Unfortunately, he died before our children were born. But my mom did live long enough to see them, which was the greatest of blessings. So that is the story of Mois and Sara Bourla. It's a story that had a great impact on my life and my view of the world. And it is a story that, for the first time today, I share publicly. However, when I received the invitation to speak at this event, at this moment of time, when racism and hatred are tearing at the fabric of our great nation, I felt it was the right time to share the story of 2 simple people who loved each other, loved the others, they were loved by the others, and they loved their family and friends. 2 people who shut down hatred and build a life filled with love and joy. 2 people whose names are known by very few, but whose story has now been shared with the members of the United States Congress, the world's greatest and most just legislative body. and that makes their son very, very proud. That brings me back to remembrance. As time marches on and today's event shrinks in our rearview mirrors, I wouldn't expect you to remember my parents' names, but I implore you to remember their story. Because remembering gives each of us the conviction, the courage, and the compassion to take the necessary actions to ensure their story is never repeated. Thank you again for the invitation to speak today, and thank you for remembering. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you. Dr. Bourla, thank you for telling your family story and for your inspiring words. We receive your words as also being in honor of all those others who made it through and of those who perished during those horrible years. We are very proud of your contribution to the world today, and the fact that it is the son of Holocaust survivors who is making this contribution is very meaningful to all of us that are gathered here today. We will now receive remarks from our congressional sponsor.